So yesterday we are discussing about the IOT commands, right? And other functions, input, output functions, variables, and about the next is we are on the Raspberry Pi. That is a part of your these are all we have studied, right? And loop input out also, writing console is also over. I think we are in the Raspberry Pi. Okay, now in the Raspberry Pi, the Raspberry Pi is a series of credit card sized single board computers developed in the United Kingdom by the Raspberry Pi Foundation to promote the teaching of basic computer science in schools and developing countries. The original model got way too popular than anticipated outside the target market uses and the later models of various such as robotics accessories. Several generations of Raspberry Pi have been released. The first generation Raspberry Pi is a Model B was released in February 2012, and this is followed by a simpler and inexpensive Model A. In 2014, the foundation released a board with a improved design in Raspberry Pi 1 Model B Plus. The model laid the current mainline form factor. Improved A plus and B plus models were released a year later. A cut-down compute model was released in the April 2014, and a Raspberry Pi Zero with smaller size and limited input-output and general purpose input and output abilities was released in November 2015 for the $5. Okay, so US dollar it is only cost about $5. Okay, and this the Raspberry Pi 2 which added more RAM was released in the February 2015. Raspberry Pi 3 Model B released in the February 2016 is a bundle with the onboard Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. As of 2016, Raspberry Pi 3 Model B is the newest machine Raspberry Pi. These boards are priced between US dollar 5 to $15. Furthermore, so all models featured a Broadcom system on a chip, that is a SoC, okay, and which is going to include the ARM compatible central processing unit and the chip graphics. Proceeding with the, see now you can see the Raspberry Pi board, a low cost credit card sized computer. Oh, so it contains, you can see the different parts of your Raspberry Pi model. If they are going to ask explore Raspberry Pi model, you need to write like this. All models featured Broadcom, okay. It is a GPI video core. CPU speed range will be 700 megahertz to 1.2 gigahertz for the Model 3, and onboard memory range from 256 MB, that is a megabyte to 1 gigabyte RAM. Secure digital card were used to store the operating system and program in either the ASDHC or micro ASDHC size. Most boards have been between 1 and 4 USB slots. You have a HDMI, you can see there, that is the high definition media interface, okay, and videos output, and it is 3.3 phone jack for audio. Lower level output is provided by a number of GPIO general purpose input output pins. You can see there that is a 40 pin, okay, which supports common protocols like 12C. The B models have 8 PC Ethernet board and Pi 3 has no board Wi-Fi 802.11H and the Bluetooth have been imported. The foundation provides Raspbian, a Debian-based Linux distribution for the download as well as the third-party Ubuntu, Windows 10, IoT Core RISC operating system and specialized media Sensor Center Distribution Foundation also provides a Python in Scratch as the main programming language with the support for many other languages. The default forms are is closed source while an unofficial open source is available. Okay, now you can see the LCD displays the power jog and PI camera is also there, and I told that thin 3.mm audio jack is also there, and there is a RJ45 Ethernet connector, and you have the 4 USB ports. Okay, and you have 40 pin general purpose input and output in the Raspberry Pi board. This is the small electronic circuit, so we call it as the Raspberry Pi board, circuit board. Okay, why we are going to use the Raspberry Pi? So what are its advantages? And here we are going to make the Python as a programming language for the Raspberry Pi. And this is why we are going to use the Raspberry Pi is because of its inexpensive and it is a cross platform. Cross platform means you can work these on any operating system like Ubuntu, Windows 10 and RISC OS Linux operating system also, right? And it is simple, clear programming environment, open source, and it is extensive software and open software and extensible hardware we have, right? And that is the reason why we are going to use the Raspberry Pi as the model for connecting the IoT devices where a lot of information can be gathered and it can be transported to the end users and the end devices, right? And Raspberry Pi is a operating system will be the Raspberry IBM-C or Arch Linux or RISC OS or Open AL or EC Fedora. Okay, and the video output what we are getting is through the high definition multimedia interface and or composite or CA, and it has a LCD. See there LCD display. It is of 640 into 350 to 1920 into 1200 including so 1080 pixel PAL or NTSC standard. And you have the power source that is a micro USB. You can see there in next to the after LCD display down you can see there power jack is there. Okay, where you are going to connect the. We have the processor. The Broadcom BCM2835 sock used in the first generation Raspberry Pi. So because of some reasons, right? So this is somewhat equivalent to the chip used in the first generation smartphones. Its CPU is an older ARM version 6 architecture. Okay. So that is why they are going to take the processor with 700 megahertz or ARM of say 1176J ZFS processor, video core TV, graphics processing unit, RAM. This has a level of cache 16 KB and a level of L2 cache of 128 KB. The level 2 cache is used primarily by the general purpose unit. Okay, and sock is stacked underneath the RAM chip, so only its edge is visible. The Raspberry Pi 2 uses a Broadcom BCM2836 sock with the 900 MHz 32-bit quad RAM, quad core ARM Cortex A80 processor as do many current smartphones we have in nowadays, right? With a 256 KB shared L2 cache memory is of 256 KB. The Raspberry Pi 3 uses a Broadcom BCM2837 SoC with a 1.2 GHz 64-bit quad-core ARM context. Okay, with this, and it is going to share the L2 cache. Okay, and power source which is connected over there. The recommended and easiest way to power the Raspberry Pi via the micro USB port on the side of the unit. The recommended unit input voltage is 5 volts and the recommended input current will be 2 amperes. Okay. Then the Raspberry Pi can function on a lower current power supply, example 5 volts at 1 ampere. Okay. Minimum will be 5 volt 1 ampere. However, any excessive use of USB ports or even heavy loading can cause the voltage to drop and instability during the use. The latest version of the Raspberry Pi B plus A plus have low voltage indicator icon to notify the user if there is a problem with the power. SD card. So that is you have a SD card in the latest version of a Raspberry Pi board. This Raspberry Pi does not have any locally available storage accessible. The working framework is a stacked on a SD card which is embedded on the SD card space on the Raspberry Pi. Okay, and you can see there on the top 40 pin GPI. Okay, that is the general purpose input output. This is a non-specific pins on the coordinated circuit. It is known as an input or output pin which can be controlled by the client at the runtime, and these general purpose input output pins have no exceptional reasons characterized and go unused as a matter of course. These general purpose input output capabilities may include the pins can be designed to be input or output. They can be empowered, crippled, right? And these input values are meaningful. High is 1, low is 0. It yields values or writable, meaningful. Input values can frequently be utilized as IRQs regularly for the wake-up occasions. In programming environment, the general purpose input output board alternative alludes to the pins by the number of the pin and the outline beneath. The general purpose input output BCM choice alludes the pins, the Broadcom SOC channel number. These are the number after the general purpose input output in the green rectangular and the outside of the underneath graphs. And you can see their LCD display, right? And this Raspberry Pi connector S2 is a display serial interface for connecting the liquid crystal display panel using the 15-pin ribbon cable. The mobile industry processor interface inside the Broadcom of BCM2835 IC, which is going to feed the graphics data um, directly to the display panel through this connector. This article looks at the connector pin out and some of the display panels compatible with the port. Then come to the audio jack. You can see there the 3.5 mm thin audio jack, right? And the standard of this is a connector is accessible on the Raspberry Pi for stereo sound yield. Any earphone or 3.5 mm sound link can be associated straightforwardly in spite of the fact that this jack cannot be utilized for taking the sound information. USB mics or USB sound cards can be utilized. And come to the status of LEDs. Okay, There are 5 status LEDs on the Raspberry Pi board that demonstrate the status of different exercises as taken after. Okay, power, FDX, link, and the SD card. Okay, and Ethernet port is also there. You can see that RJ45 Ethernet port, and this is accessible on the Model 5B plus light. It is not available in the B and the previous older generation circuit boards, and it can be associated with a system web utilizing a standard LAN link and Ethernet port. The Ethernet port are controlled by microchip LAN 9512 LAN controller chip. Then come to the CSI connector. The camera serial interface we call is a serial interface outlined by the Mobile Industry Processor Interface Organization together went for interfacing computerized cameras with a portable processor. The Raspberry Pi establishment gives a camera uncommonly made to the Pi which can be associated with the PI utilizing with the CSI connector. You can see there PI camera, right? That is about the camera we are talking. Then we have the acronym for the USB ports, right? So where we are going to connect any number of USBs which are required to run your Raspberry Pi board, and you have the HDMI, that is the interface give both video and the sound yield, that is a high definition multimedia interface. It performs both video as well as the audio. So that is about the the Raspberry Pi board. That is, when we are going to explore a Raspberry Pi board, you come across these many the parts of the Raspberry Pi. So this is a socket where what I explained about the system on chip is an integrated circuit that coordinates all parts of the PC on the other electronic framework into the solitary chip. It may contain the advanced, simple, blended, regularly radio recurrences work all the solitary chip substances. Okay, and this is a SOC compromises of a microcontroller chip. Okay, and display core. Some SOC called multiprocessor framework on chip incorporates more than one processor at the center. Memory pieces including a choice of ROM, RAM, EEPROM and streak memory. Timing sources including oscillators and stage bolted circles. Peripherals which are going to include the counter clocks, ongoing clocks and power on reset generators. And outer interfaces including the industry norms. For example, if you take a USB, Firewire, Ethernet, etc. Okay, and there is a simple interface including the analog to digital counters and digital to analog counters, right? And voltage controllers and power administration circuits also present. Then when you come to the accessories of this Raspberry Pi, numerous embellishments and peripherals for the Raspberry Pi go from USB center points, engine controller to temperature sensors. There are some official establishment for the Raspberry Pi as a takes after. So camera on 14th May, that is 2013, the establishment and merchants of RS components and Ethernet 14 propelled and Raspberry Pi camera board with a firmware redesigned to it Raspberry Pi camera board contains a 5 pixel sensor interfaces through a stripe link to the CSI connector on the Raspberry Pi. This Raspberry Pi supports can be empowered by introducing or moving up to the most recent variant of operating system. After that, running the Raspberry Pi configuration. And we have the USB up in spite of the fact that not an official it is an exceptionally suggested extra for a PI, okay, Raspberry Pi. If you feel like the USB hub with 7 additional ports is accessible to all the online stores, it is mandatory to utilize the USB hub to associate other hot plates or different adornments and draw the control from the USB port as of energy to them. Okay, then Raspberry Pi will have some interfaces here. These are the different commands to run from a terminal on a command line. So rasp config is there. It is going to change the configuration settings of your Raspberry Pi. Startx, it start the graphical user interface. Okay, IF configuration is going to configure the Ethernet or the wireless network adapter, and RPI update is there that it updates your Raspberry Pi firmware. Sudo run commands as a super user, right? And shutdown command, if you are going to type, this will shut down your Pi. And nano, if you are going to type in the command line prompt nano, this is your text editor for changing or adding the files, which saves your file, edit your file and create your file. And you have another SSH, okay, that is you are going to connect your PI to other computers. So these are the different basic Pi command line useful commands to run from a terminal or a command line. Okay, then come to the some other commands command lines which are going to be run under the that is a Raspberry Pi. One is a LS. You people are already familiar in the Linux or the Unix operating system. I think you have even studied the command line commands also, right? So some of the commands are also similar to your Unix or Linux operating system. See now, so ls it is used for list out the current directory files, okay? And cd, so cd stands for change directory, right? Go to the directory or a folder. So from your when we want to change from one directory into another directory, we use a cd, okay? That is the cd stands for change directory. Then we have find the searches the whole system for files or directories. Then you have a command called as a clear. It clears the terminal screen, and then mv moves the files or the folders. Touch. Touch is also a command which is given in the command line prompt. It creates a blank file. Okay, suppose you want to edit some file, right? So you are going to give a touch command which is going to create a blank line. So mkdir or mddir, that is a both are used for creating a directory. That is a mk stands for a make directory. You are creating a new directory, right? And ping, okay? So this is a command which you are given in the command line. Ping test connectivity between the two devices, whether they are working properly or not. Okay, we are going to check by the command ping, so whether two devices are able to communicate with each other or not. Okay, and df-h, so to display the disk space. Okay, it is going to display the disk space. So IW config, it is a wireless configuration tool. Okay, when we are going to give a IW config, so this is a wireless configuration tool. Okay, next you come for the hardware layout of your the Raspberry Pi. That is a this is a physical devices and the end points to your the IoT devices. Okay. And before that, let me study about the Raspberry Pi operating system. Okay, so Raspberry Pi operating system can be installed on the Raspberry Pi through your SD cards, right? And most use of these micro SD slot located in the bottom of the board. Normally, we use a micro slot SD board for the purpose of storing the programs, running the programs and all. Okay, and this Raspberry Pi primarily uses Raspbian, a Debian based Linux operating system. Other third party operating system available via the official website, which includes Ubuntu, right? Ubuntu Mate, Snappy Ubuntu Core, Windows 10, IoT Core, okay? And Windows 10, you have two versions. One is a Windows 10, the other one is a Windows 10 IoT Core, okay? Which supports our connecting the Raspberry Pi board and the information gathered from the different devices, okay, which is going to help. And RISC operating system and specialized distributions for the Kodi Media Center and classroom management. Many other operating systems can also run on the Raspberry Pi. So operating systems which are not based on the Linux or RISC OS or Pi, a special cut down version of the RISC operating system, and it is 16 MB cards and larger for all model of Pi 1 and 2 has also been made available. So free BSD, net BSD, okay, Plan 9 from Bell Lab and Inferno, Windows 10 IoT Core, a number cost edition or the Windows 10 offered by the Microsoft that runs the natively on the Raspberry Pi 2. And these are about the not Linux based operating system. When you come to the Linux based operating system, you have Debian using Kodi open source digital media center, open source, Raspberry Pi Fedora Remix, and Gelato Linux, Diet Pi, CentOS OpenWin, Kali Linux, Arc OS, Kano OS, and the Nard SDK. Okay. The next one is a media center operating system, that is OSMC, Open LAC, Libre ELC, ZN, Raspbilex. Arduino operating systems is Volumino, okay, Primus 6 box, Reno Audio, and the D Audio. So recall box operating system are Happy Game Center, Lacka, okay, Chameleon and People. So all these operating systems are pre-installed in the Nubos operating system, which is already available in many authorized as well as the independent seller. There are many other operating systems for Raspberry Pi in market like Nubos, Raspbian, okay, and third party operating system are also available like Ubuntu Mate, OSMC, RISC OS. To set up an operating system, we need a SD card with minimum capacity of 8 GB. Okay. So formatting, suppose when we want to do the formatting on the SD cards, right? So format the SD card before copying the Nobos onto it. To do this, what we have to do is we have to download the SD formatter 4.0 from the SD Association website for either Windows or the Mac. Follow the instructions to install the software. So we already familiar with how we are going to install the software, and it's keep on giving the instructions when you once any software you start installing. So that software is going to give the instruction for you what to do, what not to do, why and all. Okay, and follow the instructions to install the software. Whatever the instructions, it is going to give the guidelines, right? So we have to follow those instructions. Then insert the SD card into the computer or laptop SD card reader and make a note of the driver letter allocated to it. In SD formatter, select the drive letter, the SD card is and format it. The OS installation, suppose we want to install the operating system, we have to follow some steps in order to work on the installation of operating system. Go to Raspberry Pi Foundation website and click on the download section. Okay, then click on the Nobus with click on the download zip button under Nobus offline and network install, and select a folder to save this zip file. Extract all the files from the zip. Once SD card has been formatted, drag all the files in the extracted Nobus folder and drop them onto the SD card drive. The necessary files will then be transferred to the SD card. When this process has finished safely, remove the SD card and insert it into the Raspberry Pi. Okay. For the first boot, plug in the keyboard, mouse and monitor cables. Right. Now plug the USB cable into the Raspberry Pi. Now Raspberry Pi will boot and Windows will appear with a list of different operating systems that we can install. We recommend using Raspbian. Tick the box next to the Raspbian and click on install. Raspbian will then run through a installation process. Note that this can take a while. When the installation process is completed, the Raspberry Pi configuration menu, the Raspberry Pi config, I told no that command line command will load. Here we should set the time and date for our region, enable a Raspberry Pi camera board or even create a users. Okay, that is how you have to do it. The installation of your Raspberry Pi operating system. So the hardware layout of this Raspberry Pi will have the Raspberry configuration, which is going to do it is a configuration tool in Raspbian, allowing you to easily enable features such as the camera and to change your specific settings like keyboard layout and config text. This is a Raspberry Pi configuration file, and wireless networking, configuring your PI to connect to wireless network using the Raspberry PI 3 or PI 0WS inbit wireless connectivity or USB wireless single. Then wireless access point, configuring your Pi as a wireless access point using the Raspberry Pi 3. That is a Raspberry Pi 3 means it is a model 3. Okay. And PI 0WS inbit wireless connectivity are the USB wireless dangle. Okay. Then the using the proxy server, we can setting up your Pi to access the internet via proxy server. Then the high definition multimedia interface configuration will guide you to setting up your HDMI device including custom settings, and audio configuration will switch your audio output between the HDMI and the 3.5 mm jack. Then camera configuration, if you are going to give it in the command line, installing and setting up of the Raspberry Pi camera board will be done with this command. Then external storage configuration, mounting and setting up external storage on the Raspberry Pi. So localization, setting up your Pi to work in your local language or time zone. So default pin configuration will be changing to the default pin states. So different pins will have their own default status, right? All the default pins are going to set to their default states. So device tree configuration will do the job of device trees, overlays and parameters. And kernel command line, how to set the options in the kernel command line. So UART, how to set up the onboard UARTs. Firmware warning icons, description of warning icons displayed if the firmware detects issues. Okay, then these are all about the LED, uh, booter, screensaver, okay, securing your Raspberry Pi, LED warning flash codes. Description of the meaning of LED warning flashes that are shown if a PI fails to boot or has to shut down. Okay, securing your Raspberry Pi is some basic device for making your Raspberry Pi more secure. And screensaver, how to configure screen blinking or screensaver. And the boot folder is there, that is what it's for and what is there in it. So, and that is all about the how we are going to work on the IoT device, that is Raspberry Pi physical devices for the IoT, and what all the commands that we need to configure the Raspberry Pi board, and which is the operating system we are using for the Raspberry Pi, and language which we are using is the Python language. Okay, and when it comes to interacting with a Raspberry Pi, the first and most common is to use like you full desktop computer, just a smaller, and also involves connecting a keyboard, mouse and monitor. With this setup, you are likely best served by the installing the Raspbian with a desktop, which gives you full graphical user interface to work with. This is the best option if you want an experience similar to working with other operating systems such as Windows, Mac OS and other popular Linux flavors like Ubuntu. So that is about the Raspberry Pi operating system, and different command line comments that we are, what is the function of that each and every command, how your Raspberry Pi board is going to be installed on the IoT devices, right? That is a physical IoT physical devices. This is also one of the physical device.